All right. Hello, everybody. I'll be talking about Chapter 4 today from our AMSCO APUSH textbook, Chapter 4 on Imperial Wars and Colonial Protest. This lecture video is going to talk a lot more about the French and Indian War. The textbook only spends a couple of pages on it, so I'm going to spend much more of my time talking about the French and Indian War. I'll briefly go over some of the events from the Road to Revolution at the end, but then we'll spend a lot more time on that in class. So again, focusing much more on the French and Indian War. First, I started talking about France. France finally shows up. When we first started looking at Chapter 1, Chapter 2, it was mostly Spain and Portugal that were the first explorers to the Americas, and then England showed up in 1607 and beyond. Like England, France showed up a little bit late to the colonization party, if you will. If you were an APUSH, you might remember in the 1500s, they are fighting their own religious wars. You might remember the Huguenots, who were the French Calvinists. And then they finally have peace in France in 1598. Once King Louis XIV, you might remember him if you were an APUSH, he was our classic example of an absolute monarch. Once King Louis XIV shows up, one king, one law, one faith, trying to have absolute power, he tries to gain colonies as a way to gain more power. Trying to get as much resources and wealth as possible to enrich himself. And so under King Louis XVI, King Louis XIV, my bad, in the 1600s, France focuses mostly on modern day Canada. And so you can see here, Spain is in Mexico, Central America, South America. Britain is in the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. France, they are in the Midwest, but then also in Canada. And then you can see that there's some disputed territory in between there, which will become very important soon. So France's colonies, and you can actually see here population differences. There's only about 250,000 people living, there are 250,000 people living in the British colonies, permanent settlements, whereas in the French colonies, only 15,000. So they were not building permanent settlements. They're building fortresses, trading posts, not permanent settlements. So yeah, New France grew very slowly, only 60,000, 50 years after that last image. And their main economy was trade. Beaver pelts, animal furs from beavers and animals like that. They had generally better relations with the natives. They viewed the Native Americans as a country that they should negotiate with, rather than a people whose land they should steal. But they also slaughtered their animals, destroyed the Native Americans' ecosystem just for wealth, which obviously created a lot of problems for the Native Americans in their way of life. And so when we talk about French colonization, it is mostly in modern-day Canada. There are no large settlements. Instead, they're going to build forts, trading posts for animal furs, beaver pelts, and things like that. There's going to be all sorts of clashes between the three main European countries who are in the Americas: France, Spain, and England. Oftentimes, France and Spain would ally together against England. The natives would oftentimes pick different sides based on whatever would benefit their tribe's interests. And so there were a decent amount of these kind of smaller skirmishes, smaller conflicts between the European countries in the Americas. But it was never that developed, and it was never that wide scale because, it says at the bottom, home countries thought America wasn't valuable enough to invest resources. This is before the Americas were fully built up with a full-on economy and infrastructure and trading system. And so England, France, Spain, they didn't think it was worth shipping tens of thousands of soldiers and resources and supplies to the Americas. And so a lot of these early conflicts were much smaller. And so because of this, as the British start to become more hands-off, like they settled the Americas in 1607 and beyond, but they start to become a little bit more hands-off. This is what's known as salutary neglect. I did not mean to close that. Sorry. This is what's known as salutary neglect. salutary neglect, and we're going to say that that's like the early 1700s to mid 1700s. This is when England becomes more hands-off with their colonies. They do not enforce laws necessarily, and so that's going to lead to a lot of self-government within the British colonies. That's going to lead to a lot of smuggling, not just buying British goods, because normally under colonialism, what's called mercantilism, you'd only be able to buy goods from your mother country, but if they're not enforcing the laws, then, well, the colonists can do whatever they want. And so there are the beginnings, if I can spell right, of an independence movement in 13 colonies. Again, because of this concept called salutary neglect, which is definitely an idea that you need to be familiar with. Okay, there are a lot of kind of key events that lead to the American Revolution, but one of them is the French and Indian War, and I'll do causes and effects when we get to the table in just a second. The French and Indian War, 1756 to 1763, is also called the 7 Years' War in Europe, because, get this, it lasted for 7 years. And it was basically all about a competition for land, greed over the region called the Ohio Valley. It was a little unclear as to who controlled the Ohio Valley. The British colonists were expanding westwards towards Ohio, whereas the French Empire had fortresses around that region, sometimes even in the region. And so the British claimed that they had the right to colonize the Ohio Valley. Meanwhile, France is building forts in the same region. George Washington, who will eventually become our first president and founding father, if you will, of America, he takes 150 soldiers to Ohio, basically to take the land for himself, kills the French leader, and says, "This is our land." And so when we're talking about the French and Indian War, this is 1756 to 1763. I'm gonna do a table here with causes and effects, maybe. You can do the same if you want. So there is a competition over who controls the Ohio Valley. And this is a conflict between France and England, generally. This war eventually spreads to Europe, where it becomes known as the 7 Years' War. And because war spreads to Europe, most of the European countries, they don't really care about fighting the French and Indian War because they've got their own war on their hands back in Europe. If you want to look at the actual sides of the 7 Years' War, you've got Spain, France, and Austria, generally speaking Catholic countries, against England and Prussia, generally speaking Protestant countries. In the middle of the 7 Years' War, or actually, sorry, the French and Indian War, or actually at the beginning of the French and Indian War, we see the first meeting of colonial governments. This isn't a continental congress yet. That's going to be a little bit later. This is what's known as the Albany Congress in New York. Albany is the modern-day capital of New York. And this was only 7 colonies, but still majority. 7 colonies who met together, who basically realized, hey, we need to work together. We have a common enemy. At that point, it was France. We have a common enemy that we need to unite against. And so they decided to raise funds for this war. So I'm going to list this as an effect, even though this is kind of early on in the war. The Albany Congress of 1754, 7 of the 13 colonies meet to unite, raise taxes for the war. And so again, this is like an early step towards unification as a United States of America. when the war finally ends, in Europe, it ends with a stalemate. In Europe, nothing really changes. Land doesn't really change hands much. But in the Americas, it's a huge victory for the British or for the British colonists. France loses basically all of their land in North America. They still hold on to some of their Caribbean islands, such as Haiti, but they lose most of that land. Spain gets a lot of it, Louisiana, Cuba. Britain gets Florida. And so because of that, Britain now becomes the dominant power in North America. Before this, it was kind of like Spain, England, France were all kind of on like somewhat of an even playing field. Now England or Britain, they're the very clear number one. So in terms of effects, Treaty of Paris, 1763, says that France has to give up most of its American colonies. So Britain becomes the number one power in the Americas, let's say. They're able to develop a massively strong navy, and they become the European power in the Americas, because at this point Spain has kind of faded. Spain has had several military defeats during all of this. And so this map does a good job of showing us kind of the transfer of lands. I'll move my head down here. This is before the war. You can see the British in bright green, the French in that like magenta lilac color, and then the Spanish in orange, pretty evenly distributed. After the war, the British have this huge chunk of land, and the Spanish gained some land as well. The Spanish are on the decline at this point back in Europe, whereas the British are on the rise. And so it's only a matter of time before England starts to chip away at some of that Spanish land. Okay, so in addition to Britain winning the French and Indian War and gaining all of these colonies and basically giving France the boot and kicking them out of the Americas, it also leads to a lot of friction in the 13 colonies between the British soldiers who were sent there to fight and the colonial subjects who were living there. So again, this is a conflict or friction between the colonists, the people who live in the colonies, and the British soldiers who came over to fight the war. There's conflict over taxes, over whose land it is, how where the soldiers should live, things like that. And so some colonists were very frustrated. They refused to provide troops for the war. They refused to pay for the war sometimes. They refused to provide housing for the war. But yet they still said, well, England, you should be protecting me. You should be giving me my rights and things like that. And so there, just to kind of get this over here, there is some increased tension between the colonies and Britain during the war. It also says here the English colonists traded illegally with the French and the Spanish during the war because, hey, they just want to save some money, make a good deal. They don't really care about whether they're buying it from Mother England. But the one thing to add here, that last bullet point, the colonies are still not united. Even the 7 out of 13 colonies that met together at the Albany Congress, that's still only 7 colonies, which means 6 colonies are not there. So French and Indian War is an important step towards the American Revolution. We begin to see some of these colonies beginning to unite. We begin to see some conflict between the colonists and the British, but it's not happening yet. It's just kind of the seeds, if you will, of this later conflict. And so after the French and Indian War, the British basically began to realize, okay, like, number one, holy crap, we have so much more land in the Americas. It's so much more valuable. We don't have to deal with the French anymore. So the British begin to look at the Americas of like, hold up, we got to make sure we kind of put that on lock. And they also become frustrated with the colonists and their disobedience, if you will. And so after the French and Indian War, the British tried to reassert some control in the colonies. They first create something called the Proclamation of 1763. It's sometimes called the Proclamation Line of 1763, because it was a line that basically said, hey, colonists, y'all are not allowed to make settlements east of this line. It was the Appalachian Mountains. And you can see that line. Yeah, you can see that line right here. And so even though the British won this huge tract of land, the English are telling the colonists, hey, y'all are not allowed to move past this line. You can only have your settlements along the coast. Now, they did this to try to prevent clashes with the natives, because that had led to the French and Indian War and a bunch of other skirmishes. And so from the British point of view, they're trying to maintain some peace, maintain some stability, prevent conflicts. But for the Americans, for the colonists, they're thinking, well, we just fought this war, we just won this land, and now you're not even going to let us use it. And so the American colonists basically ignored it. They continued to push west, and they continued to colonize this land. And so this is, I'm going to label this as Road to Revolution. This is still like an effect, I guess, of the French and Indian War. But it kind of deserves its own bullet point. So Proclamation of 1763 says, Britain says that Americans cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angers the colonists, or I'm just gonna say angers Americans who settle anyway or expand anyways. That's problem number one. Problem number two, again, in response to the French and Indian War, is Britain raises taxes on the colonists to pay off their war debt. They just fought the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War, same thing, just different places. They had a huge debt, and so they got to pay off this debt. And so that's what we're going to focus on much more in class this week or next week, whenever the heck you're watching this. Again, here's our colonies. Here's the proclamation line of 1763. But they still own, well, quote unquote, own this land off to the east. And so we're going to explore all of these terms in much more detail throughout the week, but I do want to get them in writing here as well. So yeah, Britain raises taxes on the colonies to pay off the war debt. There's a lot of important ones. The Stamp Act is one of them. Stamp Act of 1765 basically puts a tax on any printed paper in the colonies to raise funds for the war. So that's letters, that's documents, that's contracts, things like that. And this begins a movement in the American colonists that's kind of captured by their slogan, no taxation without representation. Them basically saying, well, y'all can't tax us because we don't even have a vote back in England. Like, we don't have any power. You all over in England, you're making all the decisions for us, and you can't just tax us and not give us representation. Also, remember that the colonists were used to self-government. Remember that the colonial governments had a lot of their own parliaments or congresses, and then because of salutary neglect, England had become hands-off, so they had become much more comfortable much more comfortable creating their own laws or forcing their own laws. Historians actually say the taxes were actually kind of fair. Like, the taxes were not abnormally high. They were a reasonable amount for what people were paying back then. But still, the American colonists, they were used to ruling themselves. They were used to creating their own taxes, and they didn't want the British to come and tell them what they should pay. The Townshend Act was additional taxes on merchants on things like tea and other traded goods. Two famous events that, again, we're going to explore much more next week. The Boston Massacre, when 5 people were killed, 5 colonists were killed by British troops. It wasn't really a massacre, but Samuel Adams, if I'm remembering my history right, who was one of the founding fathers, signed the Declaration of Independence, also had a newspaper. He called it the Boston Massacre in the newspaper headline to basically rally the people against the British. The Boston Tea Party is when the American colonists, basically, they had been used to smuggling. Remember up here, they had become used to smuggling goods and buying tea from the Dutch. The British are now saying, nope, you have to pay our tea, or you have to buy our tea rather. And so the Boston Tea Party, some American colonists dressed up as Native Americans, went onto a ship in the Boston harbor and destroyed a whole bunch of tea. We'll ignore the problematic cultural appropriation of them dressing up as Native Americans and blaming them, but whatever, it's become part of American folklore. And then the coercive acts, again, which we'll explore more, which weaken colonial governments. And so all of these different acts were seen as the British government trying to tell the colonists what to do when they had become used to self-government. And so all of that's going to lead to quite a bit of conflict moving forward. Oh, and that's it. Cool. So I will just project this whole thing up. If you want to pause it right now, and we will continue this story in class.